Have you ever watched someone go through cancer treatment and just kind of shrink? It is an incredibly heartbreaking thing to witness.
Yes, it really is devastating.
And usually, when we see a patient losing that much weight, we just assume the reason is obvious. We assume the tumor is essentially ravenous, right? Like it's just eating all the calories the person takes in.
Right, the classic parasite idea.
Exactly. Or we think, well, they're going through heavy chemotherapy, they are terribly nauseous, and they are just too exhausted to stomach a full meal. We really crave that simple cause and effect math. Calories in, calories out.
Well, I mean, it is a very comforting assumption. But biologically, it is a massive misunderstanding of what this disease actually is. If we treat that weight loss as just a simple math problem of calories in versus calories out, we completely miss the underlying pathology.
And that brings us to today's deep dive. We are pulling from a monumental 2026 review published in the journal Cancer Cell. We're looking at a condition called cancer cachexia. And what the authors of this paper lay out completely shatters that whole passive starvation myth.
It really does.
Yeah.
I mean, our mission today is to decode cachexia for what it really is. We have to strip away the idea of simple malnutrition and understand this as a systemic hijacking.
A systemic hijacking.
Yeah. The tumor is not just some passive lump of tissue stealing a few nutrients in the background. It acts like a rogue organ that actively and aggressively forces the entire body to dismantle itself.
Okay, let's unpack this. If the tumor isn't just sitting there eating the food, what exactly is it doing? I was reading through the source material, and instead of a parasite, I started picturing like a malicious computer hacker.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. It's not just stealing your body's Wi-Fi bandwidth. It is actively sending out biological spam emails that trick your body's servers into crashing. So what is actually in this biological spam?
So in oncology, we refer to those spam emails collectively as the tumor's secretome. It's a highly complex cocktail of inflammatory signals released directly into the bloodstream. You've probably heard of cytokines, right?
Yeah, the signaling proteins that drive inflammation.
Exactly. The tumor secretes heavy hitters like interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, and IL-1 beta.
Okay, those are the usual suspects in almost any major inflammatory response. But how do those signals floating in the blood translate to, someone's muscles actually wasting away? Do the cytokines just dissolve the tissue?
Not directly, no. And that is where your hacking analogy works so well. These cytokines circulate until they find specific receptors on the surface of your muscle cells.
Okay.
When they bind to those receptors, they flip a master genetic switch inside the cell. That switch essentially screams at the muscle to start breaking down its own internal structures. So the tumor doesn't do the physical dismantling, it just tricks the muscle into doing it.
That is incredibly sinister.
It is.
But the paper mentioned cytokines are really only part of the arsenal. The tumor also uses physical delivery vehicles.
Yes. Extracellular vesicles, or EVs.
Like tiny biological Trojan horses.
That is exactly what they are. They are microscopic lipid bubbles packed with concentrated danger signals, specifically these stress proteins called HSP70 and HSP90. The tumor ships these Trojan horses directly through the circulation to the host's muscles.
Oh, wow.
And the fascinating and honestly terrifying part is what happens when they arrive. These danger signals interact with receptors on the muscle cells that are normally reserved for detecting severe bacterial infections.
Wait, so the muscle cell is being tricked into thinking it is fighting off a massive bacterial infection?
Correct. The muscle cell panics. It initiates an extreme stress response, which triggers a metabolic self-destruct sequence.
Unbelievable.
And while the tumor is tricking the muscle, it is simultaneously manipulating the host's immune system. The review highlights a very specific feedback loop seen in pancreatic cancer, or PDAC.
Right, the feed-forward loop. How does that work?
So the tumor sends out a chemical beacon called CCL2. This beacon recruits standard white blood cells macrophages into the tumor environment using the CCR2 receptor.
So the hacker recruits the body's own security guards.
And turns them into henchmen. Once those macrophages enter the tumor microenvironment, they get hijacked. They use a signaling pathway, CCL5, ChIF6, and NF-kappa B, to send a new inflammatory signal back to the tumor.
Like they're talking to each other.
Exactly. And that signal commands the tumor to release a highly destructive chemical called tweak. They get trapped in this toxic echo chamber. The immune system and the tumor are constantly amplifying each other's signals to break down the host's tissue.
That explains the signaling and the manipulation, but I know there is a massive energetic drain happening at the exact same time. I read the section on the Cori cycle, and I really need you to walk me through it, because initially it sounded like the body was doing something smart.
Yeah, it does sound smart at first.
Right. The tumor burns sugar, it makes a bunch of lactate waste, and the liver recycles that waste back into usable sugar. Isn't recycling a good defense mechanism?
It sounds like a brilliant defense mechanism until you look at the thermodynamics of the cycle.
Yeah.
Tumors are highly glycolytic. That means they burn glucose incredibly fast, but very inefficiently, dumping massive amounts of lactate into the bloodstream as a byproduct.
Right.
So your liver steps in to keep your blood sugar stable, peaking up that lactate and converting it back into glucose.
Turning trash back into treasure.
But the energy math just doesn't work. It takes significantly more cellular energy, more ATP, for the liver to do that complex chemical conversion than the tumor ever gained by burning the glucose in the first place.
Oh, so the liver is just bankrupting the body's overall energy reserves, trying to clean up the tumor's metabolic trash.
It's a futile, energetic hamster wheel. The tumor constantly gets its fuel, but the host system burns itself out entirely, just trying to maintain the supply line.
Wow. Okay, so if I'm tracking this whole first phase, let's do a quick recap. Tumors are basically fighting a multi-front war. They release a toxic secretome full of cytokines and these EV Trojan horses. They trap the immune system in a toxic feed-forward loop, and they drain our energy via the Cori cycle.
That's a perfect summary.
So here's a question for you listening. If you were a scientist designing a defense system, would you try to block the tumor's spam emails from being sent? Or would you try to protect the body's inbox from reading them? Keep that in mind.
It's a great question because researchers are trying to do both right now.
Right. So if the tumor is the hacker sending the signals, let's look at the collateral damage. What is actually happening inside the servers that are crashing?
Let's start with the most visible casualty, which is skeletal muscle. To understand how muscle vanishes so quickly, we have to look at the cell's internal garbage disposal, which is called the ubiquitin proteasome system, or UPS.
That sounds incredibly dense. How does this garbage disposal actually work? Let's use an image to remember this.
Okay, picture this. When a healthy cell needs to destroy an old or damaged protein, it tags it with a tiny molecule called ubiquitin. Think of ubiquitin as a bright fluorescent sticky note that simply says, "Destroy me."
A fluorescent sticky note. Got it.
Under normal conditions, specialized worker enzymes carefully place these sticky notes only on actual garbage. Then, the actual disposal unit, the proteasome, reads the sticky note and shreds whatever it's attached to.
Simple enough, but in cachexia, I am guessing the tumor messes with the sticky notes.
It completely overrides the system. Those tumor signals activate a specific pathway in the muscle called p38-beta MAPK,
Okay.
which then triggers a transcription factor called CEBP-beta. And what that does is massively upregulate a specific worker enzyme, an E3 ligase called UBR2.
Wait, so the tumor sends a signal, but it's our own body's demolition crew, this UBR2, that actually knocks down the support beam.
Yes, and they just start indiscriminately slapping those destroy me sticky notes on healthy functioning muscle.
Indiscriminate.
Well, actually, it is highly targeted. UBR2 specifically seeks out your fast-twitch muscle fibers. The proteasome reads millions of these inappropriate sticky notes and just shreds the vital structural proteins. And to make it worse, there's mitochondrial dysfunction and denervation damage to the nerve connections, so the muscle has absolutely zero energy to rebuild.
It really is an inside job. The body is doing the demolition, and this isn't just happening to muscle tissue. People with cachexia lose huge amounts of fat, too.
Yes, the adipose tissue. And the fat loss often becomes active before the muscle loss is even visually obvious. The tumor's inflammatory cues activate enzymes in your fat cells called ATGL and HSL. They act like molecular scissors.
Just snipping things apart.
Exactly. They rapidly snip your stored fat molecules into free fatty acids and dump them straight into the bloodstream. This is called lipolysis.
I want to pause on the fat section for a second because there was a detail in the source material that felt a bit contradictory. It's been a lot of time talking about fat browning in mice, where white fat turns into brown fat and burns up a ton of heat. But then it seemed to walk that back when it came to human patients.
Yeah, it's a vital distinction in the research and a really great example of why curing diseases is so difficult. In lab mice, tumors force white fat, which is basically just a storage blubber, to turn brown. Brown fat, driven by a protein called UTP1, is designed to act like a furnace. It generates heat by short-circuiting its own energy factories.
Right, causing a massive calorie burn. But mice aren't humans.
Exactly. When researchers looked closely at human PE scans, that fat browning effect just does not consistently show up in humans the way it does in animal models.
So a drug that successfully stops fat browning might completely cure a mouse of cachexia, but do absolutely nothing for a human patient in the clinic.
Which is a sobering reminder of why human biology requires highly nuanced, human-specific biomarkers.
Okay, so the muscle gets shredded from the inside out, the fat gets snipped apart. But the part of this review that genuinely gave me chills was what this syndrome does to the brain. Because, if you are listening to this and you have ever tried to care for a loved one with cachexia, the most frustrating, agonizing part is the lack of appetite.
It's heartbreaking.
You beg them to eat. You make their favorite foods. But they aren't just stubbornly refusing food, are they?
No, not at all. They're facing a literal chemical blockade. The review details how tumors secrete a specific stress-induced hormone called GDF-15. This hormone travels through the bloodstream and targets a very specific axis in the hindbrain, the G4 receptors.
And if I remember the anatomy correctly, that specific part of the hindbrain sits outside the blood-brain barrier.
Yes. Yeah. Which makes it incredibly vulnerable to whatever the tumor is dumping into the circulation. When GDF-15 binds to those receptors, it completely overrides the body's normal hunger cues. It forces a profound, persistent appetite suppression.
The patient is chemically locked out of feeling hunger. I think that is so important to emphasize. If you have felt guilty because you couldn't get a loved one to drink a high-calorie shake, this explains why. Their brain was being held hostage by a tumor hormone.
And the systemic collapse doesn't stop at the brain, by the way. The liver starts churning out acute phase proteins like CRP, driving more inflammation. The heart muscle starts to atrophy through the exact same sticky note destruction system we saw in skeletal muscle. Even the gut gets hit. The dysbiosis allows bacterial toxins to leak right into the blood.
It is a full-body domino effect.
Completely.
Okay, time for another quick check-in. The body's own systems are turned against it. Muscles self-destruct via UBR2. Fat breaks down via molecular scissors. And the brain is chemically forced into anorexia by GDF-15. So, listener, which of these hijacked systems surprises you the most? The muscle demolition, the fat breakdown, or the brain blockade? Take a second to think about that.
It really changes how you look at the human body.
It does, which naturally brings us to the most urgent question. If all of this complex multi-organ collapse is happening deep beneath the surface, how do doctors actually catch it before the patient steps on a scale? Because waiting until they're down 20 pounds is like waiting for the roof to cave in before you admit the house is on fire.
Yeah, waiting for weight loss is historically one of our biggest clinical failures. By the time the scale drops significantly, those immune loops and metabolic hamster wheels are deeply entrenched. You have to catch the sabotage earlier.
So what does the paper suggest?
It strongly advocates for using routine CT scans, which most cancer patients are getting anyway, to look for myosteatosis.
Myosteatosis. That is fat infiltrating the muscle, right? Kind of like marbling in a piece of steak.
It's exactly like marbling. From the outside, the muscle might still look relatively normal in size. But on a CT scan, its density is low because the healthy tissue is being replaced by fat. We also have to track blood markers. Not just standard blood counts, but specifically looking for elevations in that hunger-blocking hormone, GDF-15, or inflammatory cytokines like IL-6 and CRP.
And functional tests, right. The hand grip test really stood out to me.
Yes. Grip strength is an incredibly powerful predictor of a patient's physiologic reserve. A decline in grip strength, or a poor showing on a simple 6-minute walk test, can precede severe weight loss and strongly predicts how well a patient will tolerate future treatments.
Okay, so we spot the sabotage. How do we treat it?
To actually treat this syndrome, the authors propose a highly specific framework. They view cachexia as a dynamic triangle. The 3 points of the triangle are the tumor microenvironment, or TME, and the host macroenvironment, or MAE.
Okay, let's use an analogy here. It sounds like a really toxic group chat.
Oh, I like that.
Right, like if you only mute one person, the other two keep the drama going. If you only target the tumor, the hijacked immune cells in the microenvironment and the stressed out organs in the macroenvironment just keep the destructive signaling going among themselves. You have to address the whole chat.
That analogy holds up perfectly in clinical practice. You cannot just give a patient a nutritional supplement, which is only addressing the macroenvironment, and expect to fix a toxic group chat driven by the tumor's secretome. You have to intervene on all sides of the triangle at once.
Makes sense.
For the tumor side, the paper highlights targeted therapies, like specific inhibitors for the KRAS G12C mutation found in many lung and pancreatic cancers. drugs like sotorasib.
So shutting down the specific mutated gene that drives the cancer's growth.
Yes, and the beauty of that targeted approach is that by shutting down that specific pathway, you don't just stop the tumor from dividing. You immediately cut off its ability to manufacture those inflammatory spam emails. The source dries up.
And what about the brain blockade? Can we stop GDF15 from starving the patient?
We are finally starting to. There is a new class of CNS-directed antibody drugs like ponsegromab that act essentially as molecular sponges in the bloodstream. They bind to GDF15 and neutralize it before it can ever reach those receptors in the hindbrain.
That's amazing.
In clinical trials, neutralizing that hormone is actually restoring appetite and helping patients put weight back on.
That is such an incredible breakthrough. But here is where I want to push back a bit, or rather, where the paper itself drops a massive counterintuitive warning sign.
The chemotherapy paradox.
Yes, because as a layperson, I would logically assume that standard chemotherapy kills the tumor, so therefore standard chemotherapy should cure the cachexia. But the review says standard chemo can actually make the muscle wasting worse. How is that even possible?
It is one of the most devastating paradoxes we face in oncology. Cytotoxic chemotherapies, classic drugs like cisplatin and doxorubicin, are designed to kill fast-dividing cells. But they also inflict massive collateral damage on healthy tissue. Cisplatin, for example, directly and artificially activates those, destroying these sticky note pathways in skeletal muscle.
Wait, even if the tumor isn't sending signals?
Yes. The chemo drug itself enters the muscle and tells it to self-destruct. And doxorubicin directly damages the energy-producing mitochondria and healthy muscle cells.
Wow.
Furthermore, both of these drugs can cross into the brain and cause severe hypothalamic inflammation, which only worsens the loss of appetite. So the very treatment trying to save your life is actually synergizing with the tumor to accelerate your physical decline.
That is terrifying, but it makes so much sense of why patients feel so physically broken by these specific treatments. So how do oncologists navigate that impossible paradox? You can't just choose not to treat the cancer.
You navigate it by fully embracing multimodal therapy. The days of just administering heavy chemotherapy and hoping the patient's body survives are ending. The review points to comprehensive clinical trials like the NextTac trial that attack the entire triangle at once.
The NextTac trial, what does that involve?
You administer a targeted cancer drug to control the tumor, but you combine it with an antibody to protect the brain, anti-inflammatories to protect the muscle, precise nutritional counseling, and structured exercise.
Wait, exercise? You want someone who is going through chemotherapy, who is actively losing weight and fatigued, to exercise?
Absolutely. I know it sounds deeply counterintuitive when someone is exhausted, but mechanical strain on the muscle is one of the only proven ways to force that tissue to stay insulin sensitive and functionally active. The mechanical act of exercise actively fights back against the tumor's chemical breakdown signals.
Okay, let's do a final quick recap. Early detection requires CT imaging and blood markers, not just scales. Treatment must target the entire tumor TME-MAE triangle simultaneously, right? Combining cancer drugs with exercise, nutrition, and specific pathway blockers.
Exactly.
So listener, how does knowing that standard treatments like chemotherapy can actually contribute to cachexia change how you view holistic cancer care? It's a lot to process.
It really is.
If I am tracking all of this, the old historical view of cancer as just a localized lump of rogue cells is completely dead. This is a full-blown ecosystem war. And things like physical therapy and precise nutrition during cancer treatment aren't just, nice to haves. They aren't just palliative care to make someone feel a little bit better.
No, they are literal biological countermeasures. They are necessary defensive maneuvers designed to stabilize the host's macroenvironment while the drugs attempt to neutralize the tumor. Cancer cachexia is an active, aggressive hacking of the body's entire state of whole-body homeostasis, and you have to fight it systemically.
It is entirely about protecting the servers while you hunt down the hacker.
Precisely.
And that leaves me with a final lingering thought for you to take away from this deep dive. We have just spent the last 20 minutes exploring how easily our organs, our muscles, our fat, our brains can be manipulated into destroying themselves. And the tumor does this by hijacking ancient evolutionary stress pathways that were originally designed to protect us during severe infections or famine.
Yeah, it perfectly weaponizes our own ancient survival mechanisms against us.
Exactly. So if our bodies have these built-in self-destruct buttons just waiting to be pushed, what other chronic diseases might secretly be hacking our whole body homeostasis right now in ways that science hasn't even fully mapped out yet? Think about that the next time someone tries to tell you a medical condition is just simple cause and effect. It is never simple, but as we learned today, the messy, complex reality is exactly where the real breakthroughs happen. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.